Hi, thank you for joining us today. My name is Lee Hudson. I'm the Defense Technology and Influence Reporter at Politico. Today, we are talking about taking the drama out of innovation theater. Joining me today are John Doolin, the CEO of Modern Intelligence, Stephanie Halcrow, Senior Fellow at George Mason University Center for Government Contracting, and President of the Halcrow Group. Emily Harding, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Paul Lakis, Senior Vice President and Head of Global Policy at the Software and Information Industry Association. I wanted to set the stage with one of the topic that is near and dear to my heart, Congress, since I do work for Politico. And I wanted to take a stab at how Congress and DOD can make an attractive market for these innovative commercial companies. What are some steps that they can take? It seems like both organizations opine on the Pentagon's need to access the latest and greatest in American innovation to maintain a competitive edge over Russia and China. But what are some specific actions that they've taken that's worked, and where is there room for improvement? John, I wanted to let you take the first stab at answering that.
Yeah, happy to. Well, after I think many years of focusing on the early stages of acquisition for AI and small companies, things like Cibers and the slow growth of OTAs, the ways startups get pilot projects, more of the focus has gone to really taking seriously that middle phase of the growth, the move to a production contract to get companies across the valley of death. And we've seen a lot of good but varied attempts at that. DIU and the contracting tool they offer to warfighters across the entire DoD, and the funding that they're going to have more of next year is a great example because they can and do move faster. And we're seeing some pools of money and funding getting created, like the Raider Fund, and more recently, I think the APT-FIT or AP-FIT funds, which are able to go to some companies that have proven themselves and are ready for more. And these are, I would say, all great. However, I think to me and to a lot of other startups in the industry and the VC community that's trying to see if defense is worth high technology investment, fundamentally, these are still all band-aids, workarounds, and bypasses around the fundamental PPP process, which is what created the Valley of Death in the first place and what still makes it long and hard for companies to really stand on their own and get their product, whether that's AI or a drone or even just a piece of software, into real warfighters everywhere. And so I think there's been a lot of earnest attempts, but we're going to find out how strong the will actually is based on how ambitious the recommendations of the PPP Reform Commission are, and then how seriously Congress takes those. Because fundamentally, that is the core problem we're all just working together to try and avoid right
now. And Stephanie and Emily and Paul, do you think the steps that Congress has taken in terms of offering more authorities with other transaction agreements, has that helped at all? I know modifying the entire PPPE process, would be helpful as well, but I was hoping that you all could touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I can take that one. So I most recently served on the House Armed Services Committee, where I led the acquisition reform efforts for Mac Thornberry. And as we looked at what the department needed to accelerate acquisition, we found more and more that we assessed the department had the authorities that they needed. You mentioned other transaction authorities. Absolutely. They have basically a blank sheet of paper to do prototyping and then also have the opportunity to transition that to production. But what I found is I was serving my last year on the committee, and I continue to see now that I've left the committee, is the workforce needs to have better awareness of these authorities, better understanding of when is the right time to use the authorities, because not every acquisition process is right for an OT or for some other type of alternate authority that they have. And then they also have to have the support of the leadership and the culture that they're willing to take some risk by using those other authorities. So in summary, my thought is that the Department of Defense has all the authorities they need, and the focus should really be on the workforce, training, education, and awareness of what there is to use.
I can build on what Stephanie said. I think that Stephanie comes from a position of real insight, understanding the nuances of the authorities that the Department of Defense has. And I think we've seen in a few areas that the Department of Defense, over a period of time, continues to request additional authorities. And they may be in the area of procurement, they may be in the area of hiring. And Congress is generally willing to provide those authorities with certain conditions. But the challenge is then incorporating those authorities into the culture of the department. And making sure that the existing bureaucratic procedures and the employees who are there understand how to use those additional authorities. So, procurement is a huge issue in this space. I am not an expert on procurement, and I would defer to Stephanie about whether the authorities are actually there. But I think that the institutional culture is such that there needs to be some education to use the authorities that Congress has granted in order to expand your ability to acquire products and technologies, and also to make sure that you're bringing on the right staff and that your staff that's there understand how to use those new authorities.
Yeah, I would love to pick up on this idea of risk. This is something that I think everyone in this ecosystem needs to really get on the table and talk about in an upfront way, because Congress is looking at the department and saying, you have all the authorities you need, go spend them. And Congress and the department is looking back at Congress and saying, yeah, that's great, but we know that the minute that something fails, you're going to call us up here and you're going to yell at us for not getting it right. So I think Congress, too, needs to be explicit about the risk that they are accepting. I worked on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and one of the really great benefits of that committee is that all of its hearings are behind closed doors. So if there was something where you needed to have a very serious conversation about a classified program, you could do it. And honestly, it was not innovation theater at all. It was getting into the weeds and having a really serious discussion about what risk we're accepting here, what needs to be improved. And I think Congress needs to own that when they're having hearings in public or when they're making public statements, maybe put the politics aside, maybe don't look to play gotcha with the government, maybe say, we knew we were taking on a risk with some of these programs. We decided to do it anyway because it was worthwhile. It didn't work. That's okay. We're not looking for heads to roll here. Let's move forward with a new program. And that is very challenging for elected officials to do, but I think they need to explicitly tell the department and the intelligence community for that matter, it's okay. We want you to fail sometimes because that means you're trying hard enough.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks and Bill LaPlante, who's in charge of acquisition, have, said along those lines of letting us fail and let us fail fast, and that's okay. So that's really helpful. And
I can say, for what it's worth, that Deputy Secretary Hicks, she was worked right down the hall from me before she went over to the Pentagon, and I came over here. And so I know from folks who have worked personally with her that she is committed to making this happen. She's sitting up on top of a massive bureaucracy, and we talked about the culture. Trying to reach down into that culture and say, no, seriously, I mean it. Let's give this a strong go is challenging. But I know that she's the right person for the job.
Absolutely. And I guess speaking of Secretary Hicks, she has overseen efforts. I know John mentioned the Raider program, and she is trying to institute that culture of change at the department. What do you think is actually going well that they're doing at DOD in regards to this with AI?
I can kick it off just by picking up on what Emily said. I think that Deputy Secretary Hicks is absolutely the right person for this job. I think she understands the environment and geopolitical context and understands what DoD needs to do. I think the creation of the CDAO was a positive. That's the Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Officer was a positive development. One of the things that we've seen at DoD over the past few years is that there's a lot of activity around AI. And there's a lot of potentially duplicative streams that you see in the different military services. And having a centralized officer in charge of that, something even beyond the JAIC, is really a positive step. So I think strategically they are moving in the right direction. And I think Deputy Secretary Hicks is the right leader for that, to implement that vision.
Maybe I can jump on that and take the question a little bit different direction and like what they could be doing better. Not what they're doing wrong, but what they could be doing better. So, Emily wrote a really great paper recently about information and data sharing. And it talked about the need to be able to share that information and data across organizations, across agencies. And in acquisition, that's very similar to a concept of modular open system architecture, and the ability to not duplicate efforts, but make sure that the efforts are developed in coordination. Now, with AI and ML, I think there's a definite opportunity for the department to look at how they are building the data infrastructure for the whole entire department, not just one service, but the whole department, and potentially making that an open system and ensuring that the department has access to that data and owns that data, and then can provide that data to any program, any weapon system that wants to use that data. So that whole idea of MOSA, modular open systems architecture, with data sharing, it really needs to be an effort done at the highest level so that not each service or even each individual program within the service is duplicating those activities.
That's a really good point. And kind of pulling that thread, that they have said at OSD that they want slow and incremental progress when it comes to AI. Do you think they are sending a message that there is a sense of urgency, or am I reading too much into that comment? I don't know who wants to take that one, but
I mean, I think looking at the screen, a lot of our faces went, oh, when you said the slow incremental progress, because they've been moving very slowly. They've been moving incrementally. We want to see the progress part of that statement. I mean, I think they're taking steps, which is great. The urgency piece is going to come either in the form of a crisis, which none of us want, or it's going to come when somebody has a realization of just how far ahead our adversaries are in a lot of these systems and how we're not catching up. I really appreciate the shout out, Stephanie. One of the things that we tried to talk about in that paper was the sense of urgency and how we're standing on a burning platform. We just don't realize it's burning yet. I think that one of the ways that DoD is sort of coming at this backwards without realizing it is that their warfighting concepts are all moving towards this highly networked, highly integrated battlefield where you have eyes in the sky that are talking to every service on the ground, in the air, on the sea. And in order to make that work and to get that quantity of data moved around and that amount of targeting information where it needs to go quickly, you need a good bit of autonomy, and ideally you need AI ML to be pushing the right indicators down to the warfighters. And so if that's what they're setting out as the vision, the only way to reach that mission is to take serious steps forward in some of these technologies. So I think they're going to kind of drag their way backwards into the technologies they need to get to what they've laid out as the way ahead.
I think the department could also leverage commercial efforts in this area. For instance, I spent a bit of time in Arizona, and oh my goodness, all the Waymo cars driving around with no drivers in it. It's fabulous, right? So that autonomy is being developed and operationalized in the commercial sector. And I'm not sure why the department thinks that they need to build all that themselves. And they should be adopting what is out there in the commercial market and then making slight tweaks to it, excuse me. And I think the department could move a lot faster by just adopting that mindset as well.
Yeah, that they don't need to necessarily reinvent the wheel, they can build upon.
Yeah, and this gets to the acquisition reform piece too, where there's something commercially available that gets you 80% of the way there, 90% of the way there, rather than specify the heck out of your request for proposals. If you can maybe say, okay, this is the 80% that we're looking for, and then ideally it would also have these things too, but maybe you can take the commercial solution that gets you almost there and then add some capabilities you need on top of it, rather than reduce the number of people who can compete for the contract at all by making it so specific that, a startup like John's would have to spend a year just planning to apply for the proposal instead of actually saying, no, I've got something really great today.
That's a really good point. And how do you think the department can get there? Is it like mostly like a culture change, like shifting their way of thinking? Because it seems like at the highest levels, with Secretary Hicks, she is like telling them, please, like, go do this and do this quickly. I'm just trying to understand, like, how do you think they can get from like A to F, I guess, in this?
Yeah. I think I can point out two big things, both of which I think Stephanie and Emily have touched on. One is the infrastructure, which, of course, CDAO is going to be trying to get after. You just need a lot of infrastructure to deploy AI reliably, to test it, to give it data, to connect it to a network to talk to. And I think some companies like Scale actually are bringing commercial solutions that are that infrastructure, that are standard in industry, and actually can just solve like one layer of the stack. And one reason why there can and should be a lot more standardization across the services, across commands, and there already is especially as an AI company, if you talk to all the different ones who are trying to build their own platform and infrastructure, the designs are basically the same. They say, like, we're going to run Kubernetes, you're going to give us Docker images, we're going to deploy them with DevSecOps, they're going to talk over this network, and the story between things like Overmatch and Maven is very similar. And so they're kind of all independently seeing what the commercial solution is. They're just not bringing it together as one. And then the second big reason why DoD leadership I think the deeper reason why they would say they want something like slow and incremental is knowledge and trust, right? Mm-hmm. There's this rumor that got into the Defense Department a couple of years ago that AI is a black box. Neural networks are a black box. No, they're not. If you hire really good AI scientists, no, they're not. There's lots and lots and lots of time and money in industry spent on understanding these, making them reliable, putting guardrails on them. I spent almost 3 years working at Freenome, a company developing neural networks to diagnose cancer through blood tests. And they're doing trials right now. And there are lots of companies doing that. So if private industry is diagnosing cancer in partnership with the FDA, the DoD can learn how to help AIs make serious decisions.
Commercial companies out there are using AI to do things that affect life and death. And that should give great confidence to the DoD that the information is valid and trustworthy for the department to use as well.
Yeah, I think that the points that John and Stephanie just raised are really critical, because when we think about the Department of Defense and a lot of what it does, not everything it does, but a lot of what it does could potentially affect life and death. There's certainly logistical and other areas where DoD can make use of AI in very productive ways, but there's really good technology out there, and there are really smart people, there are good algorithms, and there are good data sets. I sense that one of the challenges the DoD has is really compiling the data that it has in a way that it can be usable, and making sure the data sets are clean. So it's not just about the algorithms and the tools that they have to apply those, but it's really about the underlying data. And that tends to be the biggest cost when you're looking at the private sector and different types of AI engines that are successful and those that have flaws in them.
And switching gears a little bit, so two of the Pentagon's major artificial intelligence contract initiatives are from the JAIC's Test and Evaluation Basic Ordering Agreement, and the Data Readiness and AI Development Blanket Purchase Agreement. They both took over a year to award. I guess are these like steps in the right direction? I'm just trying to get a feel for why is this taking so long? We've been talking about AI at DoD for years, and it just doesn't seem like things are happening again as quickly as they should, at least to me.
Well, I'd agree with you there. And I think if we're hearing from the department that they want to go slow and incremental, that may have a little bit of a chilling effect on some of these organizations that frankly, Jake just now CDAO just received acquisition authority in the last couple of years, and acquisition is hard. And not just because that's something that I've been involved with. It's hard. It takes a number of bodies. These bodies have to be trained. And so just standing up the acquisition and contracting workforce within an organization like Jake and CDAO to execute these contracts is a feat in itself. But again, I think we've talked about it. The sense of urgency that Emily mentioned has to be there, because slow and incremental will not win us the next war.
Yeah, I just want to echo something that Emily said earlier, which is about risk. And the current system we have, the acquisition system we have, procurement, is set up to minimize risk as much as possible. And we're talking about individuals who work for these agencies, and DoD specifically here, as well as the agency at large, and they don't want to risk, potential liability down the road for something not going right, and they don't want to risk devoting funds to a project that fails. So we have a conservative risk approach built into our system of government that makes it very hard to move quickly.
Yeah, so it's like cutting through that in some way.
Yeah, and you don't want to lose the values that got us to that risk averse place, and that is, we believe that there shouldn't be government corruption. There should be lots of transparency in awarding of contracts, that you want to be sure that government money is going to somebody who's going to provide the services that they actually say they're going to provide, and not to somebody's buddy. And we believe in taking care of taxpayer money, and that's all really important. But those values and those intentions have gotten weighed down with so much other stuff. And Paul's exactly right. I mean, you talk to contracting officers, and they just want to throw their hands up in the air, because they said, it's great to tell us to hurry, but it's my head that's on the platter if this doesn't go well, like my personal head. And that definitely has a chilling effect on trying to move forward boldly with new capabilities. It's fixable. It's going to require some bravery and some humility, I think. And I would love to see, Stephanie's great work on the HASC develop into a moment of recognition that we need to rethink in a big way some of these acquisition practices.
Yeah, you mentioned a chilling effect. So what's a way to like warm that up a little bit? Is it like continuing to do these exercises like Project Convergence that the Army does, or Project Overmatch like the Navy? What would make people at DoD, you think, feel more comfortable, and on the Hill more comfortable about moving faster with some of these things?
I think it is a lot of education. Stephanie already pointed out that there's authorizations to do a lot of great things with acquisitions. Workforce needs to be educated on it. That trust and knowledge I talked about earlier of how if you know how to test an AI and you have great scientists, they aren't black boxes. A lot of S&T folks and acquisition folks need to be educated on testing neural networks, because you don't test them like you test a plane.
And from a standpoint of working with DoD, the large prime contractors, they're comfortable. They kind of like know the lay of the land. Do you think it's a good idea to have some of these more commercially focused companies partner with the primes to like show them the ways of like working with the government? I'm just trying to get a better feel for like how DoD can break down some of those barriers of doing business with them.
So I recently co-authored a report on the Consortium model, and I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't bring that into this conversation. But the Consortium model, and there are 42 consortia out there that help different government sponsors, a lot of them in the DoD, do prototyping in a certain technology focus area. And these consortia bring the prime contractor, like you talked about, and the non-traditional defense contractor together. Now, most of them use OTs for their contracting vehicle, that agreements-based effort. But what I saw in this paper that was really striking is the collaboration between the government sponsor, the primes, the non-traditional contractors, about discussing what the requirements were and having that space to basically talk about what the risks are to the contract, talk about ways they could overcome that risk. That in many types of FAR-based contracts or non-consortia conversations, that collaboration doesn't happen. So as a way to address sometimes the risk mindset of the workforce, as well as to bring in more non-traditional defense contractors, I think that's an interesting model to continue to replicate. And frankly, there's it's not the answer to everything, because there's also other really great models out there, like Defense Innovation Unit. They're kind of like a consortia, roughly. They aren't, but for the Silicon Valley non-traditional defense contractors, but they're having those conversations and encouraging collaboration with the government sponsor, with the non-traditional defense contractors, that I think is so important to adopting technology in a quicker fashion.
I want to build on that. I think that's a really intriguing approach. To step back one foot, the challenge that we have is that the United States is facing competitors or potential adversaries that are able to move a lot quicker than we are. And even if we have better technology, we can't adopt it in the government at scale on the same horizon that other nations may be able to. And so I think we have to be creative. There's certainly the path of making more acquisition reform and educating the workforce, and we need to pursue that. But we also have to think about other avenues to try to get the technology into government, into the military at the right speed. And DIU is one attempt at doing that. In the intelligence community, Incatel is the venture capital approach is another approach. What Stephanie has talked about, a consortium model, may be a way to actually speed up that process, to bring together even if there's a handful of different consortia on different procurements, but to bring together the right players and for them to work together to address the questions, to put together a solution, and then propose that to the government. So they deal with a lot of the issues on the front end, which makes the acquisition process then potentially quicker. I think that's really intriguing and is something that we should explore.
So do you all think that the CDAO then should leverage the consortium model to help build the basic infrastructure for all the services? Is that like a good way forward potentially?
Sure, definitely. The ability that the consortium model brings to collaborate on prototypes and test them out, I think, whether you use a consortia to get to that end or the idea of, hey, let's start small, let's start building prototypes and let's test them out. And once we find a solution that works, let's transition that to production. I think that is a model that maybe is slow and incremental, but at least it would start getting to the increments part.
So maybe that's a good sweet spot then, where everyone feels more comfortable. You get a little bit of progress, but you can manage risk.
So Lee, I don't think we should limit other solutions, but I definitely think that's one to pursue. And the idea of prototyping ahead of time, sometimes there are not the financial incentives to do prototyping. So if there's a way we can try to build that into the system, I think that would be really useful. But I would definitely include consortia in an approach to kind of speeding up the acquisition and the deployment of critical technology.
I will differ a little bit on the value to commercial companies and startups of working with the primes. Mm-hmm. There is risk there. The primes are definitely very important. They're going to be here a long time, and they do a lot of great work. And we definitely look for opportunities to work with them. Mm-hmm. But if a government customer is always directing a new entrant to collaborating with a prime to make their acquisition easier, make their test and evaluation easier, there's a lot of risk there for the startup. There's risks that the prime is incentivized to take a disproportionate amount of work share they would otherwise have. There's risk that they will force them into exclusivity agreements, which will limit the future availability of the technology. There's risk that they won't give the new entrant an opportunity to build a direct relationship with the customer and the user, which will then box them out from future growth and potentially set them on a trajectory to be a acquisition, which is maybe valuable to the prime to get rid of a competitor or increase their bottom line, but maybe not always valuable to the department for that technology to blossom and become competitive.
Okay. So being cognizant of striking the right balance, because that could be potentially a huge missed opportunity for the department if they aren't attracting the commercial sector.
And that's a really important point, Lee and John. I mean, we don't want to close out the department to critical technologies, and a consortium that is centered around a prime might not be the best idea in all circumstances. But being able to combine with other companies that have complementary technologies could be useful at some points. But we definitely want to make sure that we are not limiting the department to technology that is obsolete or is not the best in class. And if there are companies out there that are pioneering innovative solutions that are going to be better, more effective, we want to make sure that those get into the department's hands as expeditiously as possible.
And I guess I wanted kind of back to what you were saying about how there aren't financial incentives for prototypes and things like that. How can the Pentagon attract these non-traditional companies and better adhere to the way that they work in terms of their profit models and what their investors expect and those types of things? How can the department become a more attractive partner there?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, if you look at the requirements for something like FedRAMP, for example, I mean, pages and pages and pages of impenetrable language. There's one line in the PowerPoint presentation for FedRAMP that says something about how be sure that anybody you're working with knows that this is a long process that requires patience and commitment. They explicitly say that. I'm misquoting them, but that's the general feel of it. And that's a well-established government program. So if that's what it is for something that's, pretty normal these days, and what's it going to be for somebody who's a startup and is trying to introduce something new and game-changing into the department? I think it's really critical for DOD to remember what it's like to be in the shoes of somebody who's never worked with the government before, and to try to provide them a guide of sorts, like this is how we're going to help you get through this process. Totally different story. I think one of the things that is a problem structurally with the way the government does this is they say, this is what we need, bring me the thing that I need. And then you're depending on the company having a year's worth of running room to create the thing that the government needs. And then if they don't get that contract, oh well. That's a year and a lot of revenue lost. If the government flipped the script on that and said, okay, here's what we need. We're going to give 6 months of running room, and we're going to give $10,000 to each one of you to come up with a prototype or to come up with a concept of how you would do it. At least you're funding the work up front for a certain number of companies. And then you could act like a venture capital firm. You could winnow it down to a smaller number and then winnow that down to a smaller number until you're paying for one big contract. Again, getting back to the discussion about values, you're going to have to be careful about, are you doling money out to people who are never going to deliver? But I still think it's worth the risk for some of these capabilities. And it would help some of the smaller companies, frankly. It would help some companies who aren't used to working with the government, some more diverse companies, kind of get in the game in a more gentle way. And I think we would all benefit from it.
And I assume that DOD does have the authority to do something like that. Is that correct? Like they could structure competitions in that way?
I would defer to Stephanie on that.
Yeah. And frankly, kind of what Emily is describing is the SBIR model, right? One of the challenges with the SBIR model and any of these prototype activities is that they often aren't married with the program office that handles the production of the neat gizmo that is designed. And so I think there are two things that go back to your question, what can the department do better? And I would say acquire commercially available products and services using standard terms and agreement, standard terms and conditions in as many contracts as possible, and then marrying up the activities that focus on prototyping and production, and ensuring that there's a link there, and not be prototyping things that just to prototype them. We really should find a link to operationalize them. Frankly, a lot of these things is to mimic more of what the commercial industry does. Commercial industry doesn't develop things that they don't think that they can't possibly bring to market.
That's a good point. We only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to give you each an opportunity for closing comments to wrap, because we hit on so many different topics. If there's something that you want to say that you weren't able to yet.
I guess I'll just say we need to go faster than we're going. But what is this saying? Slow is steady, steady is fast, something like that. Anyway, slow and incremental may be really a good idea if we are iterating those increments very quickly. And so I'm very encouraged by everything that I'm hearing out of the department. They're focused on AI and ML. I just want to make sure that they have a strategic approach that doesn't duplicate efforts and mimics or brings in commercial leading technologies and industries as much as possible.
While I was nodding fervently at all the things that Stephanie was saying, I wanted to flip over and look and be sure I got the name of this book right. It's called Arsenal of Democracy by A.J. Baim. I think I'm pronouncing his name right. A really good book. And what he talks about is World War II, the ramp up of industry to meet the need of the US government during this conflict. And what really struck me about this book is, of course, all of the strong patriotic, warm feelings about the brilliance of American innovation, the can-do spirit of Americans when faced with the challenge, and all those wonderful things. But also that there was a lot of capability in that time to take a car factory and turn it into a plane factory. These days, as nice as cars are, I'm not taking a factory and turning it into an F-35 factory. Like, that's just not a transferable thing anymore. So I think what I would close on is, first of all, read the book. It's really good. And second of all, I have a lot of faith that industry can step up and can accomplish great things. But I think we have to be more intentional these days than we have been in the past about how to support it and bring it along to a place where it's really there when we need it.
Yes.
I haven't heard of that book. I'll add it to my list, though.
One point of optimism I'll add is I believe in the department. I believe in the services. Modern is an AI defense company. We're not an AI company. The D is capitalized. We don't have a dual use product. And I do know that, government PMs, users, contract officers, they are working with a lot of constraints, and they probably have seen a lot of AI and a lot of technology that has disappointed. But I do think, especially as more industry from the bleeding edge of AI, and not industry that's trying to do AI, gets involved, we can be that education partner for the department. And I hope the department believes in us, because we're going to show up.
And I would echo a lot of what others have said. I think that the private sector has developed extraordinary capabilities, and the challenge is trying to get those into government and apply them in the right places. I think that the department has done a really good job in terms of its strategy, and a lot of the things that need to be done are probably on the not very sexy side of how do we actually make these things work with procurement without violating conflict of interest rules, and how do we make sure that we have the right talent, and how do we clean up our data sets and so forth. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I do sense that in the private sector, there's a lot of interest to work on national security issues. And I think the events of the past 2 years have really bolstered that in many areas. So I would just encourage the department to continue working with the private sector to increase its efforts with the private sector and figure out how to get those tools into government so they can be applied to productive uses.
Well, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. That's about all the time we have.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lee.
I learned a lot.